Just as cities across the country are roaring back to life, the pandemic has been replaced by an entirely different kind of crisis.
We're not buying things like steak or chops as much, only occasionally, or we look for it when it's been reduced in price.
Everything is expensive. The mortgage is much higher now.
The pension, I don't have anything spare.
There's not much room to cut back on anything else?
No, there's no room at all.
The soaring cost of living is starting to bear down on Australians across the country, and it's about to get worse. After hitting the accelerator during the pandemic, the trick now is how hard to pump the brake.
Home loan repayments are on the way down again.
Back in the 90s, the economic dragon of inflation was all but slain.
The winner is Cindy.
What followed was decades of interest rates gradually being chipped away to zero, as cheap goods flooding in from China kept prices in check, and Australia enjoyed an unprecedented 30-year boom. Suddenly, that's all changed, and we've landed right back where we started, as central banks globally rushed to snuff out inflation with the only real weapon at their disposal: interest rate hikes. There's just one problem. If household debt was an Olympic event, Australia would be a gold medalist, making us hypersensitive to interest rates.
I wanted to buy my first property for as long as I started working. It's always been the goal. And then I finally was able to in March of this year. I took out a variable rate loan. I borrowed $385,000, and that was after I had paid a 13% deposit. And I would say on the side of that, I had savings, like a rainy day fund, of probably about $5,000 or $6,000. I knew that with a variable rate loan that obviously the interest rate could increase, which increases the repayment. I guess when you hear that, or you know that, it's in the back of your head. And then shortly after moving in, I received a letter to say that the rate had increased. And then seeing that new mortgage repayment, it's a little bit scary, because you think, okay, well, this is a little bit now. How much is that repayment actually going to increase? Well, I guess one thing that people don't tell you about is when you first buy a property, there's a lot of bills that come in, water, electricity, strata fees. I think that one thing that would have to give is definitely going out and having those nice experiences, those nice dinners. That would definitely have to stop. Rates are rising, cost of living is rising. You kind of do think, when is it going to stop? At what point are they going to stop increasing the rate?
Well, tomorrow the Reserve Bank meets. What do you think they should do?
Well, I think they will increase rates. I think they have to increase rates. So they would be looking to get the cash rate back at a more normal level. I think that's probably something in the region of 3 to 3.5%, probably.
There's been a lot of talk about the amount of savings that Australian households have built up during the pandemic, and the buffers that we've got. But those buffers aren't evenly distributed, are they?
No, well, that's the point. Of course, they're not. And if you're a first-home buyer, you wouldn't have any of those buffers sitting in your savings account.
Much has been made of the Reserve Bank Governor's comments last year, which indicated rates were unlikely to rise this soon.
We still are of the view that it's unlikely that the cash rate will be increased before 2024.
Do you think the Reserve Bank should take responsibility for enticing so many first home buyers?
Yes, of course. Yeah, the Reserve Bank does have to take some responsibility for that. They do. They were clearly wanting to encourage people to go out and to borrow and to keep activity buoyant. And In doing that, they were obviously aware that at some stage in the future they were going to have to increase interest rates.
As the head of Treasury, Ken Henry advised 3 Prime Ministers, including famously encouraging Kevin Rudd to pump tens of billions of dollars into the economy during the GFC. Do you think, though, that the amount of stimulus that was provided during the pandemic was overdone?
In retrospect, it probably was overdone. We've ended up with a much larger public debt than we really should have had.
Justin, you've been living out of the US now for more than a decade. The country's going through a serious inflation problem, 8.6%. Did the government and the US Federal Reserve apply too much stimulus during the pandemic?
I want you to think back to how you felt in the middle of 2020 when we were all shut at home, fearful of the coronavirus, running rampage around the world. And so if you'd offered me a choice back then, should we as policymakers do too much, which would hopefully get the economy back on track, people back to work, and risk a little bit of inflation, or should we do too little, which the US did, Australia did not, after the global financial crisis? I would have put all my chips across the table and said, let's do too much. So given what was happening at the time and the immense uncertainty, I think they made the right set of mistakes.
When the world faced the COVID pandemic in 2020, central banks sprayed free money around the globe, backed by huge government spending programs. As lockdowns ended, suppliers couldn't keep up with the demand generated by all that extra cash. Then Russia's invasion of Ukraine sparked an energy crisis. There are shortages everywhere in materials, skilled workers, and most of all, fuel. And in response, inflation has soared. Here, it's running at 5.1%. America's clocking just shy of 9%, and in New Zealand, the nation's closing in on 7%. Just across the Tasman, our Kiwi cousins are a good 8 months ahead on the inflation fighting front. Like Australia, the country enjoyed record low interest rates before the official cash rate, or OCR, began to suddenly rise. Sharon, you're the chief economist for one of New Zealand's biggest banks. When did the economic climate start to change there?
We saw the Reserve Bank of New Zealand change its tune really in the second half of last year. They eventually ended up delivering the first hike back in October last year, which at the time was certainly made them a huge outlier internationally.
And where is it now?
Well, the OCR has been lifted to 2%. The last move was last 2 moves, in fact, were 50 basis point hikes, and it's widely expected the next couple of moves will be 50s as well.
So why do you think rates went up so quickly?
The rates went up so quickly because inflation went up so quickly. It really did come a bit out of the blue.
The ANZ Bank is a major mortgage lender. Chief economist Sharon Zollner says after house prices skyrocketed 50% during COVID, the market is now starting to deflate.
The air is coming out of it very gently, in a very orderly fashion. We've seen prices falling about 1% a month, or a bit less. They're down 5.5% in 6 months. But we're just concerned about that freak-out factor. Will they have a little bit of a panic because it's worth less than it was 6 months ago?
Raising interest rates as house prices fall, that's unusual, isn't it?
It's pretty unprecedented to be raising rates as house prices fall, and not only that, raising them at double speed.
What can Australians take away from the New Zealand experience?
I would say don't underestimate central banks' determination. Even though house prices have been falling, the Reserve Bank accelerated its rate hikes here. They're absolutely on the warpath, and it's going to take something pretty nasty to derail them from that path, I would say, at this point.
Businesses fear they may end up as collateral damage from further interest rate hikes here in Australia. In a national park 3 hours northwest of Sydney, Sebastian Boutier's off-road buggy tours had been forced to relocate amid rising costs.
The last 2 years have been challenging, to say the least. We've actually had to change venue. We're right now here in a new park setting up because of costing. The model with the other venue didn't make sense anymore for us. Now we're trying to reinvent a little bit ourselves so that we can be profitable again. As a new business, managing the bottom line is key. The gas price going up has impacted us quite a bit. Maintenance has also increased a bit because of wage increases. The parts that we need come from North America, and the delay in shipping is what hurts us the most at the moment. We've been hit sort of from all angles. We'll have to see what the impact of that on the long term is going to be, and potentially having to pass some of those costs to our customer or delay further improvements that we had in the plant. I would hope that things will bounce back in about 6 months. I would say by Christmas time, we're hoping to be sort of back to where we were, but we'll see what else life has in store for us.
That's an uncertainty shared around the globe. If the cost of living rising is because of shortages in materials and fuel, how will higher interest rates actually help that?
So high interest rates don't get Putin out of Ukraine. High interest rates don't defeat the coronavirus. High interest rates are an incredibly blunt way of trying to defeat many of our ills. That's an important point for the Reserve Bank to bear in mind right now. A lot of what's going on isn't in their remit. On the flip side, what the Reserve Bank and over here the Fed can affect is the demand side. You raise interest rates, companies don't want to build new buildings, buy new tractors. That's going to create less construction jobs, fewer manufacturing jobs. People have less money in their pocket. That starts to either push prices down or slow inflation. So you can cure inflation with high enough interest rates, but gee, it comes at a cost.
What's worse, an inflationary breakout or a recession?
A recession, no question. Absolutely no question. Costs of recessions are felt for generations.
Definitely runaway inflation. Recessions are a fact of life. I mean, will there be another recession? Yes. It's just an inevitable, and you could even say essential part of the circle of economic life.
I've looked at millions of surveys from all around the world, from years of high inflation and years of high unemployment and years of low inflation and years of low unemployment. And a rough rule of thumb is that unemployment is about twice as painful as inflation.
All these price rises are taking money out of our pockets, and interest rates are taking even more. And that's where things could get ugly, because if we don't spend, the economy could tank. And then the best we could hope for is a soft landing rather than a crash. Which raises the question, can we tame inflation without a repeat of a 90s-style global recession?
There is a lot of muttering in the United States and around the world about a recession. But on this, if you look at the usual indicators of recessions, none of them are flashing red right now. And yes, I expect the economy to slow. You can't grow gangbusters forever. But the economy's growing pretty well, and that's the single best indicator for how it'll grow next year is how it's growing this year, and it's doing okay.
How difficult is it to kill off inflation without crushing the economy? Can you navigate that successfully?
I mean, it's a great question. As an economist, I have to believe that it can be done. And I do believe that it can be done. But I wouldn't want to understate the challenge. It's a hell of a challenge.